So in this video, we're going to be looking at the output settings, and just make sure that you're in the output tab for the Maxwell Scene Manager in order to see what we're doing here. Now I've made a couple of slight additions to this document, and we'll talk more about that as we're going through these, but right now I just want you to notice that there is a 2D Face Me component here at the origin. So the first item that we have here in our output settings is export, and we can choose to export the face materials for use front or back, use front only. We can also choose to do not render hidden layers or to render hidden layers. Below that we have Auto MXM. And the idea with Auto MXM is basically a holdover from a previous version of this plugin. And the idea with Auto MXM is that you can name a SketchUp material the same name as an MXM somewhere on your system. And then what will happen is at export time, the MXM will replace the SketchUp material. Now the way that we do this is we come over here to our Options tab, and we go to our search paths heading, and we're going to go ahead and add a new search path for wherever those MXMs would be stored so that it would automatically find them. But we're not going to be using that in this particular video, so I'm just going to leave that disabled. The one we are going to look at, though, is proxies. Now, the idea with proxies is based on components. So if we go to Window, we go to Components, and then we go to In Model, you'll see that I actually have three components currently in model. I have Susan, which we always have had, and then I've got this High Poly Vase Proxy. And that is this low poly 2D Face Me. And then I have a high poly vase. Now all of these are in model, although this one is not currently in my model. It's only in my component definition. What I can do is I can make a bunch of copies of this if I wanted to. So I'm just going to come over here and I'm just going to hold down the control key and bring this guy over like so. Actually, you know what? I'll go this way. That way it snaps. And then we'll say divided by 5. That way we have just a bunch of vases, right? So these are all 2D Face Me components. There's nothing too spectacular or special about these. And as long as we have proxies disabled, they will always render as these 2D Face Me components. However, if we enable proxies, then what will happen is these will now become a high poly version of that because this was just a low poly proxy stand-in. We need to make a couple of changes in order for that to occur. First thing we need to do is we need to come over here and we need to close Fire and then re-enable Fire so that we will get a fresh export because, again, this is a geometry change, so this is going to need to be refreshed. So I'm just going to go ahead and take that. Now, this is going to take a little bit longer to export, and the reason why is because these are truly high poly. I mean, when I say high poly, I mean really, really high poly, much higher poly than you would typically find within SketchUp. So this is one of the uses of proxies is that you can have a lot of information within Maxwell that you don't actually have to have within SketchUp. And that can be a really beautiful thing because SketchUp, as you probably know very well, does not handle high poly information all that spectacularly. So that's the purpose of proxies. And you can see these guys right here. So if I just come over, click this guy and zoom in, you can see there they are. And they're rendering as high poly objects in Maxwell, but at the same time within SketchUp, I can navigate around because these are low poly proxies. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. In addition to those, we also have the ability down here of materials of doing a material override. And the idea with this is that you can quickly set up clay renders by just specifying a clay MXM on your system that will override everything but emitter materials within your document. You will not lose any of your material settings, so this is just a quick way of getting a clay render without actually losing any of your other settings. Below that, we have the setting that we can set for a default material. Now, the default material would be any material that isn't assigned in SketchUp. And of course, those are usually defined by white faces with bluish gray backs. And those would then be assigned whatever the default is. By default, within Maxwell, anything that you haven't assigned is this sort of grayish material, but you can make it whatever kind of default MXM you would like. Below that, we have tone mapping. And the idea here is that we can set the color space. So we have a lot of color spaces that we can choose from for our output image from Maxwell. And we can also set the burn and the gamma. Now, these are going to be more post-processing type effects, but at the same time, they're very useful for doing the types of work that you might want to do instead of taking it into an image application and manipulating it there. Below that, we have simulants. Now, I will say right off the bat that the thing that I want you to take into consideration when you're thinking about working with simulants is be very, very careful. These are going to impact your render time significantly. And all of them but the first one would be something that I would recommend only using if you absolutely need it. The first one, however, is something that you can use anytime you want to, and it becomes very, very handy when we're working with some extreme perspective. So let me just go ahead and show you what I mean. So I'm going to come up to Camera, I'm going to use field of view, and then I'm just going to come over here and I'm going to type in something like 22 millimeters and hit enter. Now, what that effectively means is that I'm using a 22 millimeter focal length on my camera lens. And of course, we can just click and drag within SketchUp to assign that value. But generally speaking, if we're using a small focal length, we're going to get this extreme perspective like you see here, which can sometimes be exactly what you're looking for. However, you'll notice that we're getting this very strong vignette effect. The idea being is that the smaller that focal length, the more extreme that vignette effect is going to be. So yes, we get the extreme perspective, but we also get this very strong vignette effect, which may or may not be what we want. And of course, the vignette effect is tied directly to your focal length, so always bear that in mind. Now, if we come over here to devignetting, basically what this allows us to do is get rid of that vignette effect so that we can see our lighting from edge to edge as we intended to, but still get the perspective that we want from a small focal length. So that's the purpose of our devignetting. Now, scattering is basically going to simulate bloom within the camera lens. And like I said, this is going to impact our render time significantly. So I don't recommend that you turn this on unless you really want to mimic bloom. And bloom just kind of makes everything look a little bit blurry, a little bit soft focus, kind of like they used to do where they would put the Vaseline on the lenses in order to give it that soft focus look for your glamour shots. And then below that we have diffraction. And diffraction is very much like scattering, but more complex. So if we come over here to diffraction, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we get an aperture map in order to make this work. So I'm going to come to desktop. I'm going to go to my shortcut for my SketchUp 8 install folder, plugins, Maxwell, RES, and Simulens. And within there, you're going to find some aperture blades, and you're also going to find some obstacle maps. So I'm just going to go ahead and say aperture round and say open. And then I can also do an obstacle map, and I'll do this squinted eye here. So there we go. We've got an aperture map and we've got an obstacle map. And you can see, I mean, it's really slowing down my render time. Now, generally speaking, for these types of effects, you're really going to want to set this much higher. So I'm going to set this for something more like 250. And you're going to see that we're going to get some interesting effects where we're starting to get the diffraction. And this, of course, will work much better if we're using the production render engine. Because as you can see here, we're still dealing with a lot of problems that the sample level combined with the low resolution of our output are going to really kind of make it difficult to see some of the subtlety of these types of effects. So this is something that'll work much better if you have the production version of this plugin. So if I come over here, I'm just going to switch over from draft to production, and then I'm going to switch my sample levels up to something like, say, 12, and I'm going to set my size up to, say, something like 1280, and I'm going to say done. And then we're going to go ahead and let that render. And I'm just going to go ahead and maximize this guy. As we're rendering here, you're going to see that this takes a lot longer. This is the production engine, and of course we're working at a very large file size here. And of course we're working with those Simulens effects. Now, the point of why I'm showing you this is that my feeling about the Simulens effects is that you should not turn them on until you're absolutely sure that you need them at the very end of the rendering process when you're ready to put your high quality output from the production engine. Now, of course, this is something that you would not have access to if you're using the free version of the plugin. You would only be able to render up to 800 pixels, and you would only be able to use the draft render engine. But as you can see here, we're starting to get some nice soft effects from that diffraction. And of course, we could turn that up if we wanted to. However, I'll let you play with those settings on your own, and that way you won't have to sit here and wait for this thing to render, which is going to take a significant amount of time. Now, that said, something I should talk about with render time. When you're working with Maxwell and you're working on a final output like this type of file here where we've got all our settings and we're doing some fancy stuff with Simulens, make sure that you allot a certain amount of time that you can just leave SketchUp open and walk away, because it's going to take minutes, maybe even hours to render up to its complete finished state. So definitely think about just leaving stuff to render overnight for your more complex finished renderings, because it can take some time for those finished renderings to occur. As you can see here, we're only in sample level 5, and I've got it set for a relatively moderate sample level of 12 for my finished rendering. For something like this, I might even render up to, say, sample level 24, 25, and I would definitely leave this for overnight if this was something that I was planning on rendering to a final render. However, I'm okay with this for right now, so I'm just going to go ahead and hit stop. And at this point, if I was satisfied with this, I would just go ahead and say save image, and I would just output it to whatever I wanted to. And that would be all there is to it. So that's your output. And that wraps up this plugin, and hopefully you learned a lot from this video series, and I encourage you to go read the manuals And get onto the forums if you have access to the forums, because you can learn an awful lot from just talking to other Maxwell users and getting tips and tricks from them.